In the summer of 1978, a 27-year-old man named Nolan Briggs walked into the Saline County Savings Bank in Wilbur, Nebraska, carrying a manila envelope and the quietest kind of hope, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just shows up and waits. Inside the envelope was a deed, 80 acres of farmland, 4 miles south of town, on a gravel road that didn't have a name, just a number, County Road 7. The land had belonged to Nolan's grandmother, Arlene Briggs, who had died that spring at the age of 81, leaving the 80 to Nolan because he was the only grandchild who hadn't moved to the city, the only one who stayed. The land wasn't much to look at. It was flat, which was good, but the soil was sandy. Saline County sits on the edge of where the Loess Hills give way to the Platte River sand country, and the 80 had been cash rented to a neighbor for 15 years while Arlene lived alone in town. The neighbor had grown continuous corn on it, year after year, without rotation, without cover, without putting much back. The organic matter was low, the yields were average at best, the fence was falling down, and the old machine shed leaned like it was tired of standing, but it was paid for. Arlene Briggs had owned those 80 acres free and clear since 1946, when her husband, Nolan's grandfather Lloyd, had made the final payment on the Federal Land Bank note and burned the mortgage papers in the wood stove. So Nolan walked into the bank with a deed to 80 debt-free acres and asked for a $12,000 operating loan. Enough to buy seed corn, fertilizer, diesel, and a few replacement parts for the 1961 Farmall 560 he'd bought at an estate sale for $900. That was it, $12,000 against 80 acres of paid-for land. The loan officer's name was Gerald Cook, 53 years old. Been with the bank since Gerald wore pressed shirts and a tie every day, even in July when the bank's air conditioning couldn't keep up with the Nebraska heat. He had a brass nameplate on his desk that said Gerald T. Cook, Senior Loan Officer, and he had a way of looking over his reading glasses that made you feel like you'd already been turned down before you sat down. Gerald took the deed out of the envelope, looked at it, looked at the legal description, looked at the assessed value, which in 1978 the county had at $430 an acre. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and wrote some numbers. Then he looked at Nolan over those glasses. "Son, what else do you have?" "What do you mean?" "I mean besides 80 acres of sandy ground and a tractor older than you are. What other assets? What other collateral? What other income?" "I've got the 80. I've got the tractor. I've got my hands." Gerald leaned back in his chair. "Your grandmother's 80 acres is assessed at $34,400. That's the paper value, but this land hasn't produced a decent crop in years. Your neighbor's been mining it. The soil's tired. The improvements are worthless. That shed's about to fall down. Realistically, this land might sell for $350 an acre, maybe less. You're asking me to lend $12,000 against $28,000 worth of sand. It's not sand. It's farmland. It's marginal farmland. And you have no farming history, no operating statement, no track record. You've been working at the grain elevator. I grew up on a farm. Growing up on a farm and running one are different things. Now here's the moment this story turns on. Because what Gerald Cook did next wasn't just a loan denial, it was something else. Something that Nolan would carry for 10 years the way a man carries a scar. Not because it hurt, but because it reminded him of exactly who he needed to become. Gerald picked up the deed, held it between his thumb and forefinger, and he laughed. Not a chuckle, a real laugh. The kind that comes from a man who thinks he's the smartest person in the room and wants everyone to know it. "Mr. Briggs, this deed isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Not as collateral, not as a farming operation, not as anything. My advice, sell the 80. Take the cash, whatever you can get, and put it towards something with a future. Get a job in Lincoln. Learn a trade. This land is a dead end." He put the deed back on the desk and slid it across to Nolan like he was returning a library book he hadn't enjoyed. "We can't help you here." There were 2 other people in the bank that morning. A teller named Margie, who was pretending not to listen, and a farmer named Roy Dobendick who was sitting in the waiting area for his own appointment. Roy heard every word. He told people about it later, at the co-op, at the feed store, at the VFW hall where the men drank coffee on Thursday mornings. Gerald Cook laughed at the Briggs kid. Roy said, held up his deed and laughed, told him the land was worthless. Kid just sat there and took it. Nolan picked up the deed, put it back in the envelope, stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He looked at Gerald Cook and said 5 words. "You don't know this land." Then he walked out, got in his truck, a 1973 Chevy C10 with a cracked dashboard and a radio that only picked up AM, and drove 4 miles south to his 80 acres. He sat on the tailgate and looked at it. Flat, sandy, a leaning shed and a broken fence, and a field that hadn't been loved in 15 years. And he made a decision. He would farm it. Without the bank, without Gerald Cook, without anyone's permission or approval, or $12,000. He would farm it with what he had, which was almost nothing, and he would make it work, or he would die trying. Not to prove Gerald wrong. That would come later, and it would come in a way neither of them expected. But in that moment, sitting on the tailgate, Nolan wasn't thinking about the banker. He was thinking about his grandfather Lloyd, who had burned the mortgage papers in the wood stove in 1946 and never owed another man a dime. He was thinking about what it means to own something free and clear in a world that wants you to borrow everything. Now let me tell you what Nolan did with nothing, because the nothing is what makes this story work. He had $2,200 in savings. He had the farm all 560. He had the 80 acres with the leaning shed and the falling fence. He had a strong back and a stubborn mind and the memory of a grandmother who used to say, "The land'll give you everything you need if you give it time." He couldn't afford $12,000 worth of inputs, so he didn't buy $12,000 worth of inputs. He sat down with a pencil and a spiral notebook, the same kind his grandmother kept her grocery lists in, and he figured out the absolute minimum he needed to put a crop in the ground: seed corn. He drove to an elevator in Friend, Nebraska, 20 miles away, and bought bin-run seed, leftover grain from the previous year's crop, uncertified, no guarantee, for $8 a bag instead of $45 for brand-name hybrid. Total $320 a bag instead of $45 for brand-name hybrid. Total $320. Fertilizer. He couldn't afford anhydrous ammonia at $180 a ton. So he made a deal with a cattle feedlot operator named Lyle Svoboda, 5 miles east. Lyle had more cattle manure than he knew what to do with. It was piling up in his lot, steaming in the summer heat, and the county was threatening to fine him if he didn't move it. Nolan offered to haul it for free if he could keep it. Lyle said yes before Nolan finished the sentence. Nolan spent 3 weekends hauling manure with a borrowed spreader and his farm all 560, 200 tons of free fertility, spread thin across the 80. Diesel, $430 for the season. He bought it in bulk from the co-op, paid cash, got the 3-cent discount. Parts. The 560 needed a water pump and a set of points. He found the water pump at a salvage yard in Crete for $15. He cleaned and regapped the old points himself. Total $22. His entire operating budget for 1978 was $772. Pros. The county average that year for operating costs on corn was $185 per acre. Nolan spent $9.65 per acre. Let me say that again. $9.65 per acre. When his neighbors were spending nearly 20 times that. The corn came up thin. The bin-run seed didn't germinate as evenly as certified hybrid. The stand was patchy in the sandier spots where the manure hadn't been spread as thick. It looked rough. It looked amateur. Gerald Cook drove past on a Sunday afternoon. He had a habit of driving the county roads after church, checking on his borrower's crops, and he saw Nolan's field and shook his head. Thin, uneven, ragged. Exactly what he'd expected. But here's what Gerald didn't see. He didn't see the soil. because the manure was doing something that nobody at the bank understood. 200 tons of cattle manure on 80 acres was adding organic matter slowly but measurably. It was feeding the soil biology, bacteria, fungi, earthworms, the microorganisms that break down organic material into plant-available nutrients. The sandy soil, which had been essentially dead after 15 years of continuous corn with no rotation, was waking up. Nolan's first crop yielded 89 bushels per acre. The county average was 112. Gerald Cook would have called that a failure. But Nolan did the math differently. 89 bushels at $2.30 per bushel, $16,354 gross revenue. Operating cost, $772. Net income, $15,582 from 80 acres. The county average farmer, yielding 112 bushels at $2.30, grossed $20,608, but his operating costs were $14,800 for seed, fertilizer, chemicals, equipment payments, insurance. His net income, $5,008. Nolan made nearly 3 times the net profit of the average farmer in his county. On land the bankers said was worthless. With a total investment of $770, he put $12,000 into savings. He spent $3,000 on the farm, fixed the machine shed, bought fence wire, replaced the 50/60's rear tires with used ones from the salvage yard, and then he did the same thing the next year, and the year after that. By 1980, Nolan had $28,000 in savings. He hadn't borrowed a dime. He was still hauling Lyle Svoboda's manure for free. He'd added a rotation, corn one year, soybeans the next, which fixed nitrogen in the soil and broke disease cycles. His yields were climbing, not because he was spending more, but because the soil was getting better. The organic matter, which had been 1.8% when he started, was 2.5% by 1980. His water holding capacity was improving. In a dry year, that would matter. It would matter a lot. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I need to explain what was happening in the country, because the story of Nolan Briggs doesn't make sense without the story of what happened to the American farm economy In October 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to crush inflation. The prime rate went from 12% to 21.5% by 9. Every farmer with an operating loan watched his interest payments double overnight. At the same time, President Carter's grain embargo against the Soviet Union killed the export market. Corn dropped from $3.50 to $2.20, soybeans from $9 to $5.50, and then the land values collapsed. Nebraska farmland that had peaked at over $1,000 per acre in 1981 fell to under $400 by 1986, a 60% drop. Every farmer who had borrowed against his land watched his collateral evaporate, and the banks that had made those loans watched their portfolios turn to dust. Between 1980 and 1994, more than 1,600 FDIC-insured banks failed nationwide. Nebraska alone lost dozens of rural banks. The FDIC was closing banks so fast that local bankers protested that the closures themselves were worsening the crisis. Every time a bank failed, the loans got called in, the land got dumped on the market, and prices dropped further. A death spiral. The Saline County Savings Bank, Gerald Cook's bank, started feeling it in 19. Their farm loan portfolio was heavy. They'd written loans in the 70s at 9%, secured by land that was appraised at $800 to $1,000 an acre. By 1983, that same land was worth $5. The collateral had melted like snow in April, and the borrowers couldn't make their payments because grain prices were below the cost of production. Gerald Cook, who had spent 20 years saying yes to every farmer who walked through the door during the good times, bigger loans, more land, newer equipment, expand, 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 now spent his days saying no. No to refinancing, no to extensions, no to mercy. He sent acceleration notices. He initiated foreclosures. He sat across that same oak desk from farmers he'd known for decades and told them the bank was calling their loans. 8 farms in Saline County were foreclosed between 1983 and 1986. 8 families who had banked with Gerald Cook for generations. 8 families who had trusted his advice to borrow and expand. Gerald didn't enjoy it. Some bankers did. You hear those stories, but Gerald didn't. He went home at night and drank bourbon at the kitchen table while his wife pretended not to notice. He lost 20 pounds. His hands shook when he signed foreclosure papers. But he did it anyway, because the regulators were breathing down his neck, and the bank's capital ratios were falling, and he had no choice. Meanwhile, 4 miles south of town, on County Road 7, Nolan Briggs was having the best years of his life. Not because the prices were good. They weren't. Not because farming was easy. It wasn't. But because Nolan had the only 2 things that mattered in a crisis. He owned his land free and clear, and he owed nobody anything. When corn dropped to 2.2, Nolan did the same math he always did. His costs were $10 to $12 per acre. At 95 bushels, his yields had been climbing every year. He was grossing $209 per acre and netting close to $200. That's with $2 corn. The county average farmer, with $185 per acre in costs, was losing money at anything below 2.1. Nolan didn't need high prices. He needed low costs. And he had the lowest costs in the county because he'd never stopped doing what Gerald Cook's borrowers couldn't afford to do, farming carefully. In 1984, Nolan did something he'd been planning for 2 years. He drove to a Farm-All collector's auction in York, Nebraska, and bought a Farm-All 706 diesel for $3,800 cash. It had 4,100 hours on it. Clean machine. The seller was a retired farmer who'd kept it in a shed, the kind of man who changed the oil every 100 hours whether it needed it or not. Nolan drove it home on the county road at 15 miles an hour, and for the first time in 6 years he had a backup tractor. In 1985, he added 40 acres. His neighbor to the west, a man named Dutch Harms, lost his 200-acre operation to the Federal Land Bank. Dutch's land was cut up and sold in parcels. The best 160 acres went to a corporate buyer from Omaha at $380 an acre. The worst 40, another sandy quarter section that bordered Nolan's 80, nobody wanted. Nolan bought it for $290 an acre. $11,600. Cash. From savings. He now had 120 acres, 2 Farm-All tractors, 0 debt, and $19,000 still in the bank. Now I need to tell you what happened to the Saline County Savings Bank, because this is where the story turns. In the spring of 1986, the FDIC sent examiners to the bank. This wasn't unusual. They'd been coming more frequently since but this time, the examination was different. The examiners didn't just look at the numbers. They looked at the loan files, and what they found was what they'd been finding in small agricultural banks all across the Great Plains, a portfolio full of loans secured by land that was now worth half what it had been when the loans were written, owed by farmers who couldn't make payments on crops they couldn't sell at a profit. The bank's capital-to-asset ratio had fallen below 6. The regulators classified 40% of the loan portfolio as substandard or doubtful. 3 of the bank's largest borrowers were in default. The FDIC issued a cease and desist order and gave the bank 90 days to raise capital or find a buyer. Gerald Cook tried. He called banks in Lincoln. He called banks in Omaha. He called the Federal Home Loan Bank. Nobody wanted to buy a rural agricultural bank in Nobody. The assets were toxic. The loans were underwater. The building was worth more as a storage facility than as a bank. On September 12, 1986, the FDIC closed the Saline County Savings Bank. Gerald Cook was in the building when the examiners came with the padlock. He watched them change the lock on the front door of the bank where he'd worked for 24 years. Then he drove home. The bank's assets, including the building, the furniture, the loan portfolio, and 8 foreclosed farms the bank had acquired, were transferred to the FDIC for liquidation. And here's the detail that makes this story what it is. Among the bank's assets was a parcel of farmland the bank had foreclosed on in good ground, better than Nolan's Sandy 80. But the bank had been unable to sell it because nobody was buying land in 1984. It had been sitting there, farmed by a tenant on a year-to-year lease, generating just enough income to cover the property taxes. The FDIC liquidation auction was held in November of 19. Everything went. The desks, the chairs, the vault door, the building itself, and the 8 foreclosed farms. Nolan Briggs was at that auction. He stood in the back, same as always. Work jacket, boots, spiral notebook in his pocket. He'd driven to the bank that morning. Not the Saline County Savings Bank, which was closed, but the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Crete, 20 miles north, where he'd moved his savings in 1982 after Gerald Cook had laughed at his deed. He'd withdrawn $35,000 in cashier's checks. Everything he'd saved in 8 years of farming 120 acres with low costs and no debt. The building went first. A dentist from Lincoln bought it for $22,000. He was going to convert it to a clinic. The furniture and fixtures went for pennies. The vault door sold for $800 to a man who wanted it for his gunroom. Then the land came up. The FDIC agent read the parcel descriptions. 8 farms. Some went to other farmers. Some went to speculators. The prices were low, $300 to $500 an acre for land that had sold for $800 to $500 an acre for land that had sold for $800 5 years earlier. The 80 acres on County Road 11 came up. The FDIC had it listed at $320 an acre. Opening bid, $250. A speculator from Lincoln, $260. A farmer from the next county, $208. Nolan, $310. The speculator, $320.
Nolan, $300.
Silence. $340. Going once. Going twice. Sold. To Nolan Briggs. Nolan now owned 200 acres. The original 80 his grandmother had left him. The land Gerald Cook had called worthless. The 40 he'd bought from Dutch Harms, a failed operation. And now 80 acres that had been foreclosed on by the very bank that had refused to lend him $12,000. One firmly fondlers ride per the rupple preliv. To ewer blit pure dollars, tis one bebold bell $1,000. Per se bell $1,000. Pongwat the lake to Megam pedal desert to weighing you were bell $1,000. Yas fighted blikes of stigleek fodin, havia hervan. He was farming land the bank had taken from another farmer, bought at an auction caused by the bank's own failure, paid for with cash he'd earned, farming the land the bank said would never produce anything. Let that settle for a moment. The man with the worthless deed now owned more land than the bank that laughed at him had been able to hold on to. In 1987, Nolan's 200 acres produced an average of 118 bushels of corn per acre, above the county average for the first time. The soil on his original 80 had been transformed. 9 years of manure, rotation, and careful management had raised the organic matter from 1.8%. The sandy soil that Gerald Cook had dismissed as worthless was now outperforming the heavier ground around it because it drained better in wet years, and the organic matter held moisture in dry years. His total operating costs for 200 acres, $2,400. That's $1,200. His gross revenue at 1.95 corn, $46,000. His net income, $43,620 from 200 acres, with 2 used farm-all tractors and 0 debt. There's an epilogue to this story, and it's the part I think about most. In 1988, Gerald Cook came to see Nolan, not at the bank. The bank was gone. Not at Gerald's house. Gerald had sold it to cover debts the previous year and was renting an apartment above the hardware store in Wilbur. He came to the farm, drove down County Road 7 in a car that was smaller and older than the one he used to drive, parked by the machine shed, the one Nolan had fixed in his first year, which now stood straight and solid with a new roof. Nolan was greasing the 706 in the yard. He saw Gerald get out of the car and waited. Gerald walked toward him. He looked older than 63. The pressed shirts were gone. The The reading glasses were the same, but the man behind them was different. Nolan, why didn't you be Mr. Cook? Gerald looked at the farm. The 200 acres stretching south and east, the 2 farm-all tractors, the bins Nolan had built in '86, the straight fences, the dark soil that used to be sand. I came to apologize, Gerald said. Nolan kept greasing the fitting, didn't look up. I sat behind that desk for 24 years, Gerald said. I approved loans I shouldn't have approved and denied loans I should have approved. I told farmers to borrow more. I told them land prices would keep going up. I told them bigger was better. And when it all fell apart, I blamed them. I sent the foreclosure notices. I called in the loans. I sat in that chair, and I signed papers that took away everything those families had. He paused. And I laughed at your deed. I held it in my hand and I laughed at it. 80 acres of sand, I said. Not worth the paper. And you took it back and you walked out and you did what I told every other farmer in this county they couldn't do. You farmed without debt. You built the soil instead of mining it. You saved instead of borrowed. And you're still here. He looked at Nolan directly. I was wrong about the land. I was wrong about you. And I was wrong about everything I told every farmer who sat in that chair for 20 years. Nolan put down the grease gun, wiped his hands on his jeans, looked at Gerald for a long time. Mr. Cook, the land was never worthless. You just couldn't see what it was worth because you were looking at a piece of paper in a file cabinet. You were looking at numbers. I was looking at soil. Soil's patient. It doesn't care what the bank says it's worth. It just grows what you plant, if you treat it right. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Old, yellowed at the creases. He unfolded it and held it up. It was the deed. The same deed Gerald had held between his thumb and forefinger and laughed at 10 years earlier. I've carried this every day since that morning in your office, Nolan said. Not because I was angry, because it reminded me. Every time I wanted to borrow money, every time I wanted to buy something I couldn't afford, every time I got tempted to do what everybody else was doing, I'd touch this paper in my pocket and I'd hear you laughing. And I'd think, the man who laughed at this deed is the same man telling everybody else to borrow more. Maybe the laughing is the tell. Maybe the thing the banker calls worthless is the only thing worth having. Gerald stood there for a while. The wind moved the corn stubble in the field behind them. A meadowlark called from the fence row. You want some coffee? Nolan said. Gerald nodded. They sat in the machine shed, 2 men on upturned 5-gallon buckets, drinking coffee from a thermos that had seen better days. Gerald asked about the soil, about the manure, about the rotation, about how Nolan had kept his costs so low. Nolan told him everything. Not to gloat, because Gerald asked, and because Nolan was the kind of man who answered honest questions honestly, regardless of who was asking. When Gerald left, he shook Nolan's hand. It was the first time they'd shaken hands since that morning in Nolan Briggs farmed until 20. He was 61 when he turned the operation over to his daughter Claire, the first woman to run a farm on County Road 7, though not the first to hold the land, because that had been Arlene, the grandmother who started everything by leaving her grandson 80 acres and nothing else. By 2012, the 200 acres had grown to 360 through 3 more purchases, all cash, all foreclosure or estate sales, all land that other people had given up on. The organic matter on the original 80 was 4.8%, nearly virgin prairie levels on ground that had once been dismissed as sand. The farm all 560 was still on the farm. Nolan had parked it in the machine shed in 2004. When the engine finally needed a rebuild, he decided not to do. It sat next to the 706, which Claire still used for light work. He never got rich, never bought a new truck, never took a vacation that lasted more than 2 days. But he did something that mattered more than any of that. He kept the deed. He kept it in his pocket every day for 34 years. Until the creases were so worn the paper was nearly transparent, and on the day he handed the farm to Claire, he gave her the deed, the original one, the one Gerald Cook had laughed at, And he said, "This is the most valuable thing I own. Not because of what it's worth, because of what it taught me." Claire framed it. It hangs in the machine shed, above the workbench, next to a photograph of Arlene Briggs standing in the yard in 1952, with a clothesline full of sheets and 80 acres of flat Nebraska ground behind her. Sometimes the most valuable thing a man can own is the thing everybody else says is worthless. Sometimes the safest place to stand is the piece of ground that doesn't owe anyone anything. And sometimes the man the banker laughs at is the only man left standing when the bank is gone. Nolan Briggs never forgot that morning in 1978, but he didn't carry it as anger. He carried it as a compass. Every decision he made for 30 years pointed back to that moment. The moment a man in a pressed shirt told him his land was nothing, and he decided to make it everything.